Welcome to the Fantasy Throwdown Podcast, bringing you the latest in sports news, fantasy analysis, and opinions. Don't forget the hot takes. Can't have a sports show without hot takes these days. What about hot cakes, though? I want some hot cakes. Now here's your host, ready to jump into the thick of things, Dwayne Callender.
Hello and welcome to the show, everybody. It is my favorite time of the year. You got the NBA playoffs about to begin. You got the Stanley Cup playoffs about to begin. But we are on the eve of March Madness. And honestly, it's just such a fun time of the year that, you get more casual fans paying attention to sports. And, it just makes it fun overall when people just start talking about teams that they would have no other connection to other than their alma mater or just something random to happen on TV. So without much further ado, I'm going to get into March Madness for the 2019 season. I'm going to do things a little bit differently this year, where I'm going to separately break out each region rather than doing one full-length podcast through the entire tournament. So we're going to break it up by region. Yeah, so I'll go through each region, but first I'll kind of do this to-do list on just the nature of brackets, because I still feel as though the cardinal rules get violated each and every year. So I'll say these words of advice just in terms of how you should look at your entire bracket as a whole, because you really should be looking at it as an overall product. As much as people like to pick by random items as colors or any sort of things that they just hate a certain team like Duke, all in all, the biggest thing people fail to pay attention to that they really shouldn't is the scoring format of their actual bracket pool. Depending on how it's set up, whether it's the 1 point for the first round, 2 points for the second round, 4, 8, 16, and then 32 for the championship, or if it's a different scoring format where it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I mean, there are different ways of going about it. Upset bonuses involvement. You need to kind of go through and see what the scoring format of your league is, because that ultimately kind of ends up sorting out the cream of the crop versus everybody else in the pack. Because, while it's all fun and good to just pick upsets here and there, but you have to quantify it by the opportunity cost of, you make certain selections, and if that upset bid doesn't pan out, you got to think about that next round you missed out on potential points because you picked the upset too early. It's always fun picking certain upsets, but you have to kind of bear that in mind with the overall construction of your NCAA bracket, because again, depending on the scoring format, given the typical 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, and 32 setup, you're missing out on a ton of points late on in the bracket that you might have been able to have if you kept one of the favorites in longer rather than picking an early round exit in the first weekend of the month. So again, just food for thought, but the scoring format plays a pivotal role, just sizing it up, because again, while I know it's not the sexy pick to pick favorites, the long and short of it is that picking too many upsets early kind of hurts you long term, because again, more often than not, most of these upset picks have a 30% chance at best of panning out. If it's an 8-9 matchup, yeah, sure, go for it. But once you start getting into the that range where it's, and I know the 5-12 always seems to be an interesting one just because sometimes teams get overseeded, some teams are underseeded. I'll talk about that throughout each region, but I just always want to throw out that proviso that, you should be looking at it from the perspective of, if this pick doesn't pan out, where else am I going to get points from in my bracket? So, without much further ado, let's get into the East region because, long story short, this NCAA tournament is about Zion Williamson and Duke. Whether you like it or not, Duke has the two top picks in the NBA draft on their roster with Zion Williamson and RJ Barrett in the mix. Plus, you still got Cam Reddish, who's still going to end up being a top, most likely in the top 7. I'd be shocked if he slipped any further than that. And then Trey Jones as the point guard is still highly likely to end up being a first-round pick in this year's draft as well, provided he has a strong tournament run. Duke's just loaded with talent. It's more reminiscent of what you would expect out of some of John Calipari's Kentucky teams, the way Duke is set up with Coach K this year. But, they're the prohibitive favorite. They got the absurd 2-1 odds, which you never see in NCAA pools. Given how many games they actually have to win, like 2-1 odds, you're looking usually in the range of you're looking at least bet it if it's a 4-5 odd spread for the overall favorite. 2-1. It's not even worth throwing out cash for that one. But that's how strongly the public's viewing Duke's chances, and the odds makers are viewing Duke's chances just as much. It's, I don't want to call this a coronation ceremony because we got a long way to go, and anything can happen in an NCAA tournament. One thing for sure, one of the biggest knocks on Duke is their outside shooting from three-point range and their free throw shooting. Obviously, you don't want to get into foul trouble against Duke because they can easily go on spurts, and it is very difficult to match up with Zion Williamson. I would say in terms of player comparison, it's hard to get a read on the guy because for those of you who haven't seen him play, basically he's 260 at 6'8", with the quickness of a cat. He moves around like he's a shooting guard when he has a power forward's body. And the closest comparison I've seen to him, the way he's able to maul college defenders right now, is a young Shaquille O'Neal. Not as tall, but just being able to be that bulldozer because you can't match up with him physically, and because he just can spin around you and just get to the hoop without much difficulty whatsoever. So, Duke is the prohibitive favorite by a wide margin over everyone else in the tournament. The first round matchup, again, this is not going to be anything out of the ordinary. Duke's going to roll. So we're just going to move on to the 8-9 matchup between VCU and UCF. VCU comes into this one, it's still part of the American Athletic Conference. I would say in terms of, actually, I said it, I'm saying UCF's part of the American Athletic Conference, VCU's in the A-10. But this is one of the more evenly matched teams in the first round matchups, mainly because of the fact that they both play in that low 70 range. They both have similar conference records. They don't really have as much of a large spec profile. UCF does have some wins against top 25 teams just because of playing in the American Athletic Conference. But, the one thing that UCF does have over VCU is they've got Taco Fall, who is a 7'6" center, and you'll see him when he's on the court, folks, because again, it is hard to not see a dude that tall play basketball. And obviously, being that tall, he's a shot blocker. So UCF has the advantage from a defensive standpoint. VCU plays an aggressive attacking style defense, but again, this one is more going to be splitting hairs for the most part. I would say I give a slight edge to UCF, even though they're the slightly lower seed. But that one is a matchup where, again, depending on how your scoring format goes, you can easily pick UCF on that one if you're in a format where you're getting the point for the correct pick, as well as adding points to the seed. Just because, for these types of matchups where it's a 50-50 or the lower seed has a slight advantage, it's in your best interest to try to give a little bit of a boost to the lower seeded team when you're picking out your selections, just from the standpoint of your expected value of getting that extra point there could make a difference down the road and prevent you from having to pick an upset too early. So, moving on, we'll talk about Mississippi State versus Liberty. This is one of those matchups that, everyone keeps touting as those classic 5-12 upsets. I get it from the standpoint of Mississippi State is not exactly a sexy pick. They run a very scattered kind of setup just because it's a ball hawking defense. They rank in the top 20 in both steals and block shots, but they play a very aggressive style of defense. They don't really do a great job on the offensive end, and that's the reason why that they have such a lousy record against top 25 teams, even though they played in the SEC and don't really have that impressive of a profile. They kind of beat up on more cupcakes than anything else. And when it came to actually quality competition, they lost most of those matchups. Mississippi State, I can't say is a very strong 5 seed because I think they got overseeded, to be frank. But from a standpoint of their opponent, Liberty, even though they come into this with a 28-6 record, played a pretty strong non-conference schedule, and have one of the most efficient offenses and defenses in the entire NCAA. One of my biggest pet peeves on teams like Liberty is that according to the offensive efficiency rankings through Ken Pom, so Ken Pomeroy does his annual rankings of every NCAA team. So all 353 teams, they do the statistical analysis of offensive efficiency, defensive efficiency, and tempo efficiency. And Liberty ranks 346th in the nation in possessions. They play at a very slow pace, not as bad as Virginia. We'll get to Virginia eventually once I get to the South region, but the overall issue that I have here is the fact that Liberty just plays at a slow enough pace that, when you're an underdog, you need more possessions than your opponent. Otherwise, you're forced to actually hit. You have to hit so many shots in order to pull off an upset and shoot at a high clip. So you basically, Liberty's going to have to shoot the ball from beyond the arc above 40% to beat Mississippi State because of the way Mississippi State plays. They force you to play faster than you would like. And my fear for Liberty is the fact that if they turn the ball over and aren't comfortable with the pace, this could get out of hand quickly, and that Liberty ends up being kind of playing at a pace that they're not comfortable with. And, it's when you're not doing something you're comfortable with, it usually ends up in a situation where you're giving up a lot more easier baskets than you're comfortable with. Plus the fact that, from a size standpoint, most of Liberty's players are going to be giving up pretty much 3 to 4 inches across the board in terms of height. The tallest player on Liberty is 6'8". That's really overall short, kind of compared to most teams in the field. That's why this is not one of my favorite picks for a 5-12 upset. I think there are better options on the board here. I know folks are, kind of beholden to the 5-12 pick. It's just not one I would go for here. Moving on, we got Virginia Tech in St. Louis. The Billikens got in, it's they got in based off of winning the A10 tournament, and I still think that St. Bonaventures was the better team in that matchup, but give St. Louis credit, they pulled it off, but St. Louis just had a disappointing year overall. Even though they were the preseason favorite to win the A10, they managed to get into the tournament anyway by winning the A10 tournament. But the issue is that, and this is where St. Louis has struggled all year, they are ranked 205th in offensive efficiency. They're not a good free throw shooting team, which is also a terrible combination to go along with the fact that they're terrible at shooting three-pointers. So, the issue here is that matching up against Virginia Tech, they're an excellent three-point shooting team. They're excellent at offensive efficiency, and they are ranked in the top 30 in terms of defense. To me, this is a terrible matchup for St. Louis because Virginia Tech does pretty much everything well. They don't necessarily jump out at you as like an elite Final Four team, but if there is a team in the field in the East region that can knock off Duke, I actually like Virginia Tech chances better than Michigan State. Michigan State isn't as proficient shooting three-pointers as Virginia Tech, and if you're going to beat Duke, you need to be able to hit three-pointers at a high clip. And Virginia Tech shoots just under 40%. That's what it kind of takes to beat Duke. I like Virginia Tech's chances more than anyone else in this entire region. I just think that this is one of the more lopsided matchups against St. Louis, whom, great run in the A10 tournament. I just don't see them being able to do much against a Virginia Tech team that pretty much outclasses them in most of the fields that St. Louis would need to be able to get easy buckets in, and I just don't see it happening. Moving on, we got Maryland playing the winner of the playing game between Temple and Belmont. Temple basically is on the verge of forcing out their head coach, Fran Dunphy, who's been at the helm for over a decade and basically been one of the staples of Philadelphia sports, college sports, I should say, for almost 30 years, given his prior runs with Drexel and Penn University as well, making the dance numerous times. But I think Belmont's a better team than Temple, so I think Belmont gets through. And then they matching up against Maryland. I would say Belmont has a shot against Maryland. I just don't think that they're necessarily a good chance of beating a Maryland team that is very good with offensive and defensive rankings. They're both in the top 30 in both instances. Played a tough Big Ten schedule, matched up very well against tough competition. Maryland plays at a slow pace. I mean, they're in the bottom third in terms of pace, in terms of tempo, but from a weaknesses standpoint, they really don't have anything glaring. I would say Maryland, is going to be a tough out in this tournament. I really don't think that the biggest thing Belmont can do, or Temple could as well, depending on how the game goes. But the way to beat Maryland is to force them to turn the ball over. The Terps are bottom third in terms of turnovers per possession, because they rank around 20% of their possessions end up in a turnover. So if you can get them to speed up the pace, Maryland's ball handling issues could rear their head again. But you got to be able to get them out of the rhythm and speed up, speed the game up. So you got to be able to control pace, and in order to control pace, you got to be able to score. So Belmont does have the proficiency to shoot the ball well enough. Temple, not nearly as much, because Temple's going to run the Princeton offense that Dunphy's has always been an advocate for. So, if Temple gets through, they got no shot against Maryland. I'll just be perfectly blunt. If Belmont gets in, Belmont has a shot. I just don't think it's going to happen against Maryland. Moving on to what is just a mess of a game. You got LSU, which shouldn't be in the tournament. I'll get to that why. And Yale, winners of the Ivy League this year. LSU, for those of you who don't know, there's a large scandal going on in college basketball with wiretaps, federal wiretaps catching numerous college coaches in compromising conversations discussing payments and bribes to prospective players. So LSU's head coach, soon-to-be former head coach, Will Wade, the guy is currently suspended from the team, is on multiple tape-recorded conversations discussing payments and gratuities made to a player that is pretty much strongly alleged to be Javonte Smart, the star player for LSU, and what was being offered to him. Long story short, Wade is going to be out of the picture. The NCAA, regardless, cleared Javonte Smart to play in the NCAA tournament because they cited that he has fully cooperated with their investigation thus far. Even though pretty much everyone suspected that Smart has been paid off, or his handlers have been paid off. It's not anything that's relatively new in college sports. The only thing new about this is the fact that the FBI is involved with the case, and the NCAA doesn't want to outright take LSU out of an NCAA tournament contest because of the fact that LSU had a dominant SEC run this year. They were 16-2 in the conference. They racked up 26 wins on the year. I mean, they had a terrific run this year through the beginning of the year until the story broke about the FBI wiretaps over the past month. So they got knocked out early in the SEC tournament. This is a game that, I have certain reservations about, because I don't know which LSU team is showing up. If it's the team that started at the beginning of the year, great. But the fact of the matter is that LSU has spent I would say 95% of their conversations with the press answering questions about the federal wiretap investigation and who else might be linked to some of the payoffs going on. So LSU has a lot of distractions on their mind at the moment. And from an efficiency standpoint, Yale's one of those teams that is very annoying to play against. They shoot the ball well from the outside. They don't turn the ball over that much. It's not a great matchup, on paper because LSU is incredible rebounding the ball on the offensive glass, but from a shooting aspect, they're not a great 3-point shooting team. I kind of look at this game as the last time Yale knocked off a team in the first round in Baylor, going back a couple of years ago. I think it was about 3 years ago. LSU measures up pretty closely to what Baylor usually does, being long, athletic, good rebounding team, not a good outside shooting team. This would be one of those upsets I wouldn't be shocked by because of how much is going on internally with LSU rather than the overall dynamics of this LSU team. If this was like played out in the box and there was nothing going on, this is an LSU win all day. But there's a lot more at play going on right now, and that's where my concern is, that you could actually see an upset with this one. Moving on, we got Louisville playing Minnesota. Louisville in the American Athletic Conference having a bounce-back year because realistically, this was supposed to be a rebuilding project with Louisville after the whole scandal with Rick Pitino, the escort services being provided to players, multiple suspensions being handed down, and basically Chris Mack leaving Xavier, taking a huge payday from Louisville to help resurrect their program. This was expected to be a multi-year project. He's got them back in the tournament in his first year, which is a tremendous achievement. And, a lot of it just has to do with the fact that Louisville is just very good on the defensive end. They won't blow you away from an offensive standpoint, but they do an excellent job with help defense and just being pesky. The issue that Minnesota's going to run into is that, they weren't all that impressive to begin with. The team's actually coached by Richard Pitino, so it's Rick Pitino's son that's matching up against Louisville, which I just found. I was wondering if that was some type of attempt at black humor by the NCAA putting those two teams together. But be that as it may, Minnesota just is not very good at offense. From an offensive efficiency standpoint, they're not very good. They're in the bottom third in terms of offensive rankings and efficiency, and they are pretty much below average at 3-point shooting and field goal percentage. They have to create offense through ball movement and back cut screens to get their offense, and I'm not entirely sure Minnesota is going to be able to generate enough offense with a good defensive squad in Louisville. This game's not going to be one that's pretty to watch. I'll just say that off the bat, but I just think that this plays well into what Louisville does best, and Louisville should just be able to move on here. Moving on, we got Michigan State playing Bradley. Bradley being what should be a Cinderella story, except for the fact that Bradley, upon winning their conference tournament, banned all media access to media members that they felt were unfair to the program when they had 8 losing consecutive seasons in a row. So instead of having a sweetheart story, it's more of which team has more baggage from a public relations standpoint, because obviously you got the Michigan State scandal dealing with the Larry Nassar issues over the past year and a half in the media, and then you got this Bradley story. So, the media is not going to do any favors for either one of these clubs. Michigan State's got a squad that can easily make the Final Four. They got to get through Duke. People are pissy about the seeding of teams. I felt Michigan State should have been a number 1 seed over Gonzaga. It worked out that Michigan State got the highest ranked number 2 seed, so by virtue of that, they get placed in Duke's region. That's just the way the NCAA handles their seeding for teams. But, it is what it is. But, when I look at this region as a whole, I just look at it, if Duke's going to get knocked out, it's more likely to happen in the Sweet 16 against Virginia Tech than it would against the Spartans in the Elite Eight. I just feel as though Duke's biggest test is going to come with Virginia Tech getting some extra time. It's a team that knows Duke very well. They play them all the time in the ACC. They've seen the tape on Duke. Playing them multiple times in the regular season and in the ACC tournament. Virginia Tech's going to have an idea of how to go about going after Duke, which is why I think they have the best shot at taking out Duke rather than Michigan State. Michigan State, they have the ability to do it. I just think Duke's talent is too good to carry through today. So I would say overall, Duke should come out of this region and obviously represent the East region in the Final Four. But that's where I'm kind of looking at it from a tournament standpoint. Moving on, I still think Duke's the overall favorite to win the NCAA tournament. But we'll get into some of the other regions coming up in the next episode. So that's going to do it for this show. Stay tuned to some of the upcoming episodes so you can kind of get a preview for the other regions. But that'll do it all for now. So have a good one, folks.